those of you who were here last week, we probably had the longest Bible reading on record. But this week, just a few extracts from Paul continuing. First of all then, from Acts 22:30. Paul has been arrested, as usual. The Romans are holding him. The Jewish leaders are shouting for him. The crowd are baying for his death. 22:30, the commander wanted to find out for certain what the Jews were accusing Paul of, so the next day he had Paul's chains taken off and ordered the chief priests and the whole council to meet. Then he took Paul and made him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the council and said, "My fellow Israelites, my conscience is perfectly clear about the way in which I have lived before God to this very day." The high priest Ananias ordered those who were standing close to Paul to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, "God will certainly strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you break the law by ordering to strike me." The men close to Paul said to him, "You are insulting God's high priest." And Paul answered, "My fellow Israelites, I did not know that it was the high priest. The scripture says, 'You must not speak evil of the ruler of your people.'" And when Paul saw that some of the group were Sadducees and the others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Fellow Israelites, I'm a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial here because of the hope I have that the dead will rise to life." As soon as he said this, the Pharisees and the Sadducees started to quarrel, and the group was divided. For the Sadducees say that people will not rise from death and that there are no angels or spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all three. The shouting became louder, and some of the teachers of the law who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and protested strongly, "We cannot find anything wrong with this man. Perhaps a spirit or an angel really did speak to him." And the argument became so violent that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces. So he ordered his soldiers to go down into the group, get Paul away from them, and take him into the fort. That night the Lord stood by Paul and said, "Do not be afraid. You have given your witness for me here in Jerusalem, and you must also do the same in Rome." Then there's a plot against Paul's life. There's a major military exercise with many soldiers that move him in a sort of secure way to Caesarea, to the governor there. Again, the Jews come and accuse Paul, and Paul then defends himself against Felix, who is the governor. The governor then motioned to Paul to speak, and Paul said, "I know that you have been a judge over this nation for many years, and so I am happy to defend myself before you. As you can find out for yourself, it was no more than 12 days ago that I went to Jerusalem to worship. The Jews did not find me arguing with anyone in the temple, nor did they find me stirring up the people, either in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. Nor can they give you proof of the accusation they now bring against me. I do admit this to you. I worship the God of our ancestors by following that way which they say is false. But I also believe in everything written in the law of Moses and the books of the prophets. I have the same hope in God that these themselves have, namely that all people, both good and bad, will rise from death. And so I do my best always to have a clear conscience before God and human beings. After being away from Jerusalem for several years, I went there to take some money to my own people and to offer sacrifices. It was while I was doing this that they found me in the temple after I had completed the ceremony of purification. There was no crowd with me, no disorder. But some Jews from the province of Asia were there. They themselves ought to come before you and make their accusations if they have anything against me. Or let those who are here tell what crime they found me guilty of when I stood before the council. Except for the one thing I called out when I stood before them. I am being tried by you today for believing that the dead will rise to life. So the basic pattern here that we've got is that Paul has been arrested. The Jews are baying for his death. He's moved for security reasons to Caesarea, the military and political power base of the Romans. And he is then actually, in the next few chapters, if you want to read this, he is tried before 3 governors, Felix, Festus and Agrippa. And he says much the same thing to all of them, which we're not going to read. Last week, the aggro with the Jews seemed to be almost entirely about the fact that Paul wanted to preach to the Gentiles. But the centre of these passages now move, and Paul makes it quite clear that the centre of the controversy for them and for him is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And really for us, the centre of our controversy and the centre of our life should be the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Elsewhere, St. Paul says, all I want is to know Christ and to experience the power of his resurrection. He says several times, I am on trial for my life here because I hope for the resurrection of the dead. Now, there is one point here which we read where the Pharisees, who did believe vaguely in the resurrection, you remember at the death of Lazarus when Jesus speaks to Mary, Lazarus' sister, he says, do you believe the dead will rise? And she says, yes, Master, we believe that the dead will rise on the last day. There was this vague universal sense of life beyond death. But the Romans get it right. He realizes it's not about that at all. And Festus says, when he's speaking to Felix, he says, some arguments about their religion they have, about a man named Jesus, who has died, but Paul claims to be alive. The Romans get it in one. Luther was very clear on this fact, that everywhere that Luke talks about Paul, talking about the resurrection, he doesn't mean the Pharisaic resurrection. He doesn't mean the broad Jewish resurrection. That is not that controversial, that all the Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees get it, that Paul, because he believes in the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Jesus who is dead and is alive. The Romans can see that. That's what lies behind this. This is about Jesus. It's not some vague idea about resurrection. It's about Jesus who was dead and is alive. And again, Paul says, I'm here. This is all about resurrection. And as he says, I am a follower of, with a capital W, the way, as it was called, the Christian way. I am a Jew that follows the way of Jesus who was dead and is alive. This is the core thing. This is what drives him. This is what drives the New Testament at this point, the resurrection of Jesus. And they are excited about it, whether it's Peter or Paul or Apollos or Barnabas or Philip or any. They are excited because this is not just a matter of believing in God who's always been alive. This is a matter about believing in Jesus who was dead and is now alive. And there's such a relief and excitement and interest and friction of this. Wow! That we have lost. Because we're in Lent now. And if you're like me, you will drift through 40 days and you will find it's Holy Week. And you will be serious and you will reflect upon it. But we know when Good Friday comes. And we know when Easter Day comes. And on Good Friday we could be up the top singing to the Salvation Army band like we do every year. And on Easter Day we celebrate the resurrection like we do every year. We would be most astonished if we didn't have Easter Day this year, wouldn't we? It's not like that for them. They have that edginess that says, wow, he is alive. There is a living reality here because he might not be, you know. It's the sort of thing where somebody in the Great Wars had been lost, presumed dead, and they got the letter about it, and perhaps days or weeks later they were found alive and well, and the letter comes back. It's very different to all the letters you had before to say, dear so-and-so, I am still well. We thought he was dead, but now he is alive. And him being alive is much more interesting than it was before we thought he was dead. There is that edge to it. Resurrection is not obvious. Liberal Christianity can't even believe in it. It's not easy, but it is exciting and it's interesting and it's stimulating, the power of the resurrection of Jesus. Driving along in the car, it has happened to me in the long distant past when cars were not so reliable as they are now. You're driving along in the car, you're thinking, it's okay, the car, we're going somewhere, and then the car breaks down. You know the feeling? You remember those things? You remember when cars had carburetors? You know. You start again. And you think, I'll just leave it. And it cools down. And you start. My old mini Mason was making that sound. And it would go on. And I was so much more happy about it going after it had broken down than before it broke down. Oh, it's still going. We're so much more happy about Jesus being alive when we believe he was dead. Like they were. It was like getting out of a death sentence. It's like coming out of hospital and the doc says, go away, I don't want to see you more. You're fine. Wow. You know, what a tremendous thought that is. They have that edge. We lose that edge. We want to pray this morning, if nothing else this morning, Lord, this is another communion service, but it's not just another communion service. We need to be open to experience the power of the resurrection of Jesus this morning. The reality that Jesus is here, not the doctrine that Jesus is risen, but to know his power and his resurrection and to think there is a reality here greater than any other reality. And it's personal. It's Jesus. We are resurrection people and we are Jesus people. We're not just theistic people with a doctrine about resurrection. And that's what makes the difference there when the rubber hits the road. That's what makes the difference to Paul and his mates. That's what's changing the world. That's what's making all the fuss, you know. Just want us to think that this morning. That's the centre thing. At the beginning of our passage, we can see this working out in an interesting way. Paul stood up and said, my fellow Israelites, my conscience is perfectly clear about the way in which I have lived before God to this very day. What he says is, I don't know about you, he says, but I have been right with God. I have a good relationship with God. Now that will mean two things, because Paul never says he's perfect. But on the other hand, he is sought to be obedient, and on the other hand, he is kept short accounts in forgiveness. He's been forgiven when he's gone wrong, and he's tried to do what is right. And he can say basically, I've got a good conscience with God up until this day. I have got a good relationship with the Lord. I have maintained it through forgiveness and through holiness. And he says that to the chief priest who has him beaten round the mouth. Paul says, I am all things to all men to win some for Christ. He always wants to have good relationships with the people around him. He starts off to the Jews who are shouting for his death, friends, brothers. He's very polite to the Roman authorities and treats them with respect. He's not a man who causes trouble. But when it comes to the choice between having a good relationship with other people and having a good relationship with Jesus, he always prioritizes the good relationship that he has with Jesus. I think to myself, I'm often rather the opposite. I know that it's important to have a good relationship with Jesus, but on the other hand, with people I don't know, that it could be controversial, I'd rather keep quiet when they say something silly or wrong or doing something blasphemous, or I know I should say something, but I would rather keep the peace with them than not let down Jesus, you know. And with friends. I don't want to rock the boat, you know. You don't want to rock the boat with people, do we? Why is this? We know that our relationship with Jesus is the most important, but in a way, he's less real, isn't he? Let's say it. He's less immediate. He's less tangible than they are. And they're the ones in your face. They're the ones you don't want to fall out over coffee or at dinner. They're the ones you don't want to get kicked out of the pub by. That sort of thing. You know, Jesus is there, but he's not quite so real. The fact is that for St. Paul, he is more real than Caiaphas and all that lot. You see where this dynamic of the resurrection comes in. He is more real. I've read and reread stories of James Fraser in Mountain Rain, that great missionary in southwest China. He's climbing mountains. He's having a hard time. There's a lot of demonics there, a lot of opposition. It's a terrible situation. But you realize that for him, the presence of Jesus on some mountain track is more real than all the other stuff. That's what's keeping him going. So if you and I have this experience, the power of his resurrection, we are much more likely to prioritize our relationship with Jesus. If he's only vaguely real, then he's only vaguely important. And the relationships I have with everybody else and the family and friends and people at work, they are somehow more important to keep that sweet. Paul would like the relationships with the other people to be sweet, but if that means he's got to let Jesus down, he will not do it. And so if we are resurrection people here this morning, our priority would be, over all the relationships we have with other people, our relationship with Jesus. And you see the blessing that comes to Paul from this. Luke does not speak to us much about Paul's prayer life. We know he prayed and we know some of his prayers, but not a lot of it. But what Paul does recount to Luke, and Luke writes out, is what Jesus said to him in this good relationship they have kept. The week before last we talked of this vision in Corinth 18:9. Do not be afraid, the Lord said, but keep on speaking and do not give up, for I am with you and no one will be able to harm you, for many in this city are my people. And now today we read, do not be afraid. You have given your witness for me here in Jerusalem, and you must also do the same in Rome. As Paul keeps a good relationship with the Lord as a priority, yeah, he talks to the Lord, but what he really values is the Lord talks to him. These small visions, these words from the Lord keep him going in times of distress and problem. Lots of other people are shouting him. Romans are shouting him. Jews are shouting him. Even his friends are warning him. But what he wants to hear is from Jesus. If you know the power of the resurrection of Jesus, you want to know what he says rather than what everybody else says. Certainly what you say. What a great thing that is. That Paul is sustained. Because he has a good relationship, the Lord speaks to him loud and clear. I would like that. That is a great thing to happen. What a foundation that is for life, rather than just sort of vague background, you know. And finally, I just must briefly go on here and say that this dynamic of knowing the powerful resurrection of Jesus, because it's real, because Jesus is as real, if not more real to him than everything else, this impacts his life and thus the way he's having a lot of aggro with the Jews. And that's the kingdom is growing. There is really no problem in the New Testament by people having religious views. Nobody bothered at all what Paul believed. It was just that Paul was a complete nuisance. It doesn't matter if you sort of meditate on something in a monastery somewhere. He didn't get any trouble when he was at Tarsus for a few years. The trouble is when he opens his mouth and gets going. Because, why? Because Jesus is real, and because of that reality, he does real stuff, and people are impacted and changes happen. The reality of the resurrection seeps through Paul into his life, and the peace is broken. The church grows, people change sides, but the opposition does not like it. A tangible Jesus leads to a tangible life, and that means that our lives are tangibly different, and the growth of the kingdom happens. There is no peace after that. See what? The Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't mind the odd argument with St. Paul about the Old Testament and the prophets. He was a good man. He was knowledgeable. They could talk about all those things that theologians want to talk to and nobody else does, you know. That sort of thing. He can do that. But when he says something like that Jesus was the Messiah, whoa, these are professionals who manage a permanent waiting for the Messiah. And if you are a professional who manages a permanent waiting, the last thing you want is for the waiting to end because the person had turned up. They don't like that. They're very angry about this. And when he says that this man has told them to go to the Gentiles, wow, the whole Jewish-Gentile mix, the whole thing is gone, blown up in the air. They are ballistic because there are vested interests, because there is status, because there is the status quo. And suddenly these theological beliefs, bang, and you see, people change sides. We missed out the enormous riot in Ephesus. But it says in Ephesus, that's in 1925. What are they protesting about when Paul goes in there and starts making people Christians? He says, they say, our prosperity comes from this work of selling little statues of Diana of the Ephesians. Nobody's buying them anymore. Not only is it an insult to the goddess, it's an insult to the city, but we are not making any money. It's suddenly real. The real Jesus is making a real difference. And we don't like it. There's no market for this anymore because these wretched people have all become Christians. And they're different. They don't buy idols made out of silver sold by us, you know. The crowd here, recently, just in the chapter before, what are they shouting at about Paul? He has been teaching everyone against the people of Israel, the law of Moses, and this temple. In other words, us, our social order, our status, the way we deal with ourselves as a nation, our identity, our cultural identity is a threat. How dare these people do this? They're turning the world upside down. And the Romans have no interest in theology at all. They keep on saying in a rather offhand way in their discussions, these Jews are always arguing about their religious beliefs. It's no interest to us. But this man, Paul, has caused a riot. That is of interest to us. Because we like to keep the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Send in the riot police. Bring him in, chain him up. Why? Because he believes in the resurrection? No, but because he's caused a riot. And we deal with riots. It's real. It's not a discussion, it's a riot. And so the reality of Jesus pushes through Paul into the real world. And that's what he wants to do with us. But wherever we push beyond the walls of our hearts and the walls of our chapel, where people really do not mind what we believe in here, they don't mind at all. They're not really very interested how we differ from the Anglicans of the Salvation Army. They're not interested in that. They're not interested in what the World Council of Churches is saying. Neither am I, actually. But, that sort of is not of issue. But as soon as we push through on something, because of the reality of Jesus, I remember when Sunday trading came in and we protested about it. It was a matter of money. Not a matter of doctrine. Whoa! Don't talk to us about this. This is money. This is... They want to know about that. The arguments at the moment about the whole issues of identity, gender and sexuality. You might have your views in the church, but don't tell us about them. We don't want to know about that. Any radical differences, there will be trouble. The politicians don't mind if we are quiet and well behaved. But if we say something we don't like and there's a riot, hey, what about a riot? They will be out in force. The individuals that we know, they don't mind if we're Methodists or chapel goers, but if we've got religion, they are offended. Why? What's the matter with doing the lottery? What's the matter of getting drunk in a few times? What a matter of cutting a few corners on my tax. What a matter with I want to be jealous and look after number one. Don't tell me what to do. What is it with you people? What's changed with you? What's changed with us is that Jesus is alive. Oh, I don't want to know about that. He is alive. And this is the power of the resurrection. Oh, this is a real problem for us. So that the Christian church ceases to be tame. Hey, even Cornish, don't mess with Montol. We ought to mess with Montel, all right? It's black. No, you behave. You come in on Sunday, we'll do Montel in the week. Sort of thing. Don't mess with this. Don't push. All I want us to know is the power of the resurrection of Jesus. I tell you, I have always been a Jesus person. This is a personal thing. He is alive. And if you are open to his Spirit speaking to you, that he is alive, and that makes it an absolute priority that your relationship with him is more important than your relationship with other people. And it allows you to drive changes in your lives and in the life of this church, that we are a resurrection people. Wow. That's very exciting. It's also a lot of trouble to some people, but it is an interesting thing, isn't it? That we could move on, and just like St. Paul is here, out of all this commotion, hear that word. Don't worry. You've given your witness here, and you will carry on giving your witness in Rome. The band are going to come to play for us before we celebrate not just another communion. When you come to communion this morning, you might like to think as you come to the table, what if Jesus had not risen? What if there was no bread and wine? What if we were just a historical society?